All right. A very good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us at CNX Asia Pacific 2025. I think I must start by congratulating the Digital Empowerment Foundation for putting together this very vibrant, community oriented 2 days together, where we're going to not only discuss questions like connectivity and access, but what it truly means to be connected, to be a digital citizen in this day and age, to talk rights, responsibilities, ethics, governance, critical questions that face all of us today, and indeed agency, right? As an individual who is online today, what it really means to have agency in deciding what happens with our connectivity, how meaningful our access is, what happens to our data, what sort of rights we have, what sort of models of governance we're faced with. So, without further ado, let me welcome you to our panel, which we've put together to talk about joint advocacy for community networks. And what we're going to be doing today is stepping outside of Asia Pacific and looking at models and successful instances of joint advocacy from across the world that organizations and coalitions that have, so rigorously carried out over the years, and revisit then how we can really together advocate for community networks to make sure that they have the space and the resources and the support to operate sustainably and meaningfully. I'm joined together by a very, very capable panel today. Let me please take a moment to introduce everyone. At the outset, also, please let me say my name is Neeti. I work with the APNIC Foundation. We are headquartered in Brisbane, Australia, and we serve 56 economies across the Asia Pacific, and we work on internet and digital development issues. So I will maybe start from my absolute left. Joined Joining me today is Sonia George from the Global Digital Inclusion Partnership. She is the founder and executive director of GDIP, and she has successfully led global coalitions to reduce the cost of connectivity and make universal, meaningful connectivity a reality for everyone in the global majority. She's an experienced leader and a digital policy expert. She's worked in policy development in over 50 countries, and she was recognized as one of the world's 100 most influential people in digital government in 2019. Sonia serves on various boards, and she holds a master's in public policy and degrees in economics and business finance. Next to Sonia is Andriette Esterhausen. Both of them were on the opening this morning, but let me please take a minute to also introduce Andriette to you. She was the executive director of APC for about 17 years, and she continues to work with the APC as senior advisor on internet governance. Between 2019 and 2021, she was also on the UN IGF's MAG, and she was inducted into the Internet Hall of Fame as a global connector in 2013 for her work focusing on internet connectivity in Africa, and received the EFF's Pioneer Award in 2015 for defending and promoting human rights online. And last but not the least, I am joined by Senka Hajik, who is a telecommunications engineer and digital development expert with over 10 years of experience advancing inclusive digital infrastructure, connectivity policy, and public interest technology. She's affiliated with leading digital policy think tanks, including Research ICT Africa and FGV Center for Technology and Society, and consults with various nonprofits, UN agencies, and organizations and humanitarian sectors on digital inclusion and equity. She is also coordinating the Dynamic Coalition of Community Connectivity at the UNIGF. So thank you for joining all of us today. I will maybe start by, talking a little bit about how community networks have been so far operating in a regulatory gray zone. And, as complementary access solutions, they're not recognized by the mainstream industry. So they face significant challenges, persistent challenges with not just recognition and space, but also funding and sustainability, gaps and challenges with innovation, security when it comes to connecting more and more communities, especially if they are marginalized and vulnerable. So maybe I'll start with Sonia. Sonia, on this issue, could you maybe come in and briefly, define for the room how you see meaningful connectivity and why this is so crucial for regulatory advocacy?
Thank you. Thank you also for having me on the panel. So what's meaningful connectivity and meaningful access, as Osama has been mentioning? First thing I want to share with all of you is when you think about definitions or concepts, never think of them as set in stone, right? Concepts evolve and evolve because of us, right? We change. We have different ways that we act as humans in different parts of the world, and so this concept is a reflection of how we not only use and engage technology, how we use, but how we in different parts of the world interact with technology. And I wanted to start with that because the concept of meaningful connectivity was developed out of this need to understand internet connectivity beyond just the standard, I'm connected to the internet, it's an infrastructure question, supply and demand, you can afford or not, and that's it. Because, as you already heard earlier today, when it comes to technology, it's about humans. It's about thinking about human-centered opportunities. And so when we were working on this idea of, how else can we, help people think about connectivity from a perspective that is beyond just purely infrastructure, a technical issue that is non-human, which we didn't want that. How can we do that? And so the way to think about it was to first look at quality, reliability, and how that affected us as humans in how we interacted with technology. So the concept of meaningful connectivity started shaping up from this idea that, okay, you have affordability, but then you need to have the technical foundations to allow us as humans to determine how we want to engage. And that meant having speed, reliability, frequency of use, or the use that we decide ourselves, plus having functional devices that allow us to make use of the internet and technology in general in the way that we decided. So that meant that if you have those technical foundations, which meant sufficient speed and data, frequency, and a good enough device, meaning at a minimum a smartphone, you were getting there. But then it was also very clear to us that you couldn't think just about the technical foundations again. You needed to think about the human element, right? And the social and environmental issues that shape us as humans and how we interact with technology. And so when we think about meaningful connectivity and meaningful access, we thinking beyond those technical elements, and we think about digital skills, content, language, and very importantly, as we mentioned earlier, rights. What does meaningful connectivity mean when you look at it from a rights-based approach? And so that also means citizenship, right? Some of the concepts we mentioned earlier, but most importantly, having the kind of skills, the kind of digital skills that is not just to use, to make better use, but to make smarter use. A use that is respecting of our rights, that gives us safety, privacy, that protects our data, and so forth. And without those elements, we actually don't have meaningful connectivity. So it's a holistic way of thinking about connectivity. And the last point I would make also, Nidhi, is that because meaningful connectivity is multidimensional, it also was developed from the perspective that we need to be intersectional and multidimensional in how we analyze it and assess it. So when we think about meaningful connectivity, we're not just thinking about humans as one average kind of individual. We have to think of men and women and really understand the different kinds of access and use by men and women in different parts of the world. We need to understand different uses and access in rural and urban areas, and so on and so forth, socioeconomic conditions, race, ethnicity, etc. So it's really a way of framework that not only is moralistic to think about the experience of being online, but also understanding what are the determinants of that experience, what are the social, cultural, and economic determinants of that experience that shape how we then interact with that technology. So that's how the concept came about and what we've been working on. And Henriette, I'm sure, will share with you the work that many of our partners are doing at the global level to push a lot of policy and regulation that support this concept in practice, is to use it not only to identify the gaps and ensure that we're not just thinking of inequality and exclusion in one directional way, but in a multitude of dimensions, and then have policy, regulatory, and other kinds of approaches, including business models, et cetera, that address the gaps, the inequality and exclusion gaps that continue to exist and are really stubborn and frankly getting worse in many parts of the world.
Thanks, Sonia. I think a lot of what you actually talked about also makes me wonder about how we've so far been measuring impact, right? And whether the metrics that we've been using to measure the sort of impacts and outcomes that we've had need to be revisited and looked at from the point of view of empowerment rather than just connectivity, rather than thinking about how many people are online and how many towers we've erected, etc. Really look at how many communities feel self-sufficient, independent, or at least interdependent, and so on and so forth. So I will come back to you in just a moment. Okay. But I want to carry a lot of what you said and ask Henriette maybe to comment on, how you see a lot of these multidimensional, intersectional issues that Sonia referred to. In global internet governance discussions, and especially at the IGF in the WSIS process. How do you think these platforms have influenced policy outcomes for community networks?
Not enough. Not nearly enough. Well, firstly, I always tend to not thank people for inviting me because I jump into responding to the question because I care so much of the issues. So thank you. Thank you for bringing me here to DEF, Abner, for all your work. And it's my first DCS. I've been in India before, but thanks a lot for being here. Not enough at all. I think that, in fact, I'll just use an example. The World Summit on the Information Society is this process which started in 2003. It's kind of the blueprint from the United Nations on what a developing country and other governments should be doing to ensure that we benefit from, used to be people-centered development enabled by ICTs. Now they don't talk about people, they talk about digital. And one of the opening paragraphs in the draft outcome document that member states will decide on in New York in December starts with text, 90% of the world's population now has 4G coverage. 94%, has mobile phones. And we've been trying to get this paragraph out of the document unsuccessfully, because what do both governments and powerful companies have in common? They want to look good. They want to look as if they're producing results. So this paragraph, even though averages in a world that is so unequal are meaningless, any academic, any statistician will tell you that averages are not helpful when you have big inequalities. But anyway, so the text is there. We're going to try today. There's a consultation. We're going to try and get it out.
Policy advocacy, so providing policy recommendations to the global internet governance and digital policy dialogues. So I would like to add, connecting to what Sonia said at the very beginning about definitions. I think that one of the milestones of this working group was coming up with a declaration on community connectivity, which was developed through a multi-stakeholder process from 2016 to 2017 and led by Professor Luca Belli, who most people in the community networks or internet governance sector know. So this declaration basically focused on establishing a clear shared definition of community networks, their core principles and functions, and providing a foundational framework which then can be used for policy recommendations and so on. And I think it's really important to add that that declaration is a living document, meaning it's not set in stone, and it can be constantly revised and updated to reflect technological innovations or some larger policy discussions. So, for example, as the definition of meaningful connectivity changes and evolves, that can also reflect on how the definition of community connectivity or what we are trying to achieve, how that also changes. So yeah, and other than that, in my opinion, is a significant milestone. I think that the success of the dynamic coalition has also been widely recognized in the IGF community. There was a report published last year by the DNS Research Foundation studying, evaluating the general impacts of the IGF, and the DC3 was specifically cited as one of the very influential initiatives of the IGF. We also do capacity development. So as I say, providing toolkits and manuals. And each year there is a workshop at the IGF and also a joint collaborative publication. And so the topic is always decided by the community. It's a participatory, collaborative process. And so far we have addressed issues from sustainability and financing, environmental aspects, cybersecurity. So this year in Oslo, there was the launch of a publication on self-sustainable financing solutions for community connectivity. Apart from being a convener, I would say that the DC3 is also a knowledge hub.
Thank you so much. Sonia, could I come back to you and, maybe tease out a few things that you'd mentioned when you started with your remarks? I feel like the issue that we're discussing today, which is community networks, really lies at the heart of people deciding how best to reflect their needs. And maybe if they are not served or underserved by, the mainstream connectivity efforts or mainstream actors, they can truly determine what then their connectivity or their access would look like. And in that aspect, I think communities designing interventions is what has led to complementary access solutions such as community networks being such great solutions, but they are often under recognized, which we've already spoken about. They're under resourced. So how do we really put communities at the heart of advocating for what they need, right? And I know that GDIP has done some wonderful work across the world where they've truly reflected community needs right up to the regulators. Do you maybe want to come in on that and what that process looks like?
Sure. So it's a big question. I'll try to be quick. We could have, our conversations about that. Also because it has happened differently in different parts of the world. And I think that's important to recognize. We can talk throughout today about a couple of examples. Before we go into that, I just wanted to point out something in case folks in the room are not familiar. You mentioned the statistics earlier, and Henriette was also talking about measuring and accountability. And I just wanted to make sure that you all know one thing, which is really important for this concept of understanding community-centered connectivity solutions and why we need to think about understanding where the gaps are to then have proper actions to address them. One of the ways in which the world still today, the UN, the ITU measures internet access, and it goes to the point, the averages that Henriette was mentioning, is by saying that if you've used or came into the internet once in the last 3 months, you are counted as an internet user. Okay, so when people talk about 2.6 billion people are not connected, well, actually, that is meaningless, as you were saying, because many more people are not connected, and those who are connected are not meaningfully connected because they don't have all of those elements that we talked about. So when you think about that and you think about this concept of understanding the experience of being online and being connected in this multidimensional way, then you can start understanding where the gaps are, right? And what's very clear is that the gaps are about exclusion or about inequalities that very much mirror how societies also face those inequalities and exclusions in other sectors. It's not just our sector. I think our sector has exacerbated in some ways much of the inequality and the exclusion because everyone wants to be online, that they don't realize the consequences, right? And not being online has very serious impacts, especially, as you know, here in India, governments are putting so many government public services online, and if you don't have the right type of connectivity, you basically excluded from fast, quick, efficient, digital services. So I'm saying that because when you think about the solutions and what happens, you have to think about what works where and what are the kinds of actions that need to take place to make those things happen. And there's many different things that have happened, but community-centered connectivity solutions, which are one of multiple ways in which we address inequality, lack of access, and exclusion in different communities, is important because it answers directly not just the community needs. There's a sense of ownership, and all of you can talk more eloquently than I about that experience, including here in India through the work of DEF and the different multiple centers that they've established. But not only that, you can create an environment where affordable, reliable connectivity experiences are also more directly relevant to the needs of those communities. So it's not just about developing this idea, this concept of being connected without a purpose, but it becomes more clear what the purpose of that connectivity is. And I think community networks, as one of the multiple community-centered connectivity solutions, is one that has, in many cases, not in all, but in many cases, has shown that that is not only possible, but is definitely meaningful. It can happen in ways that are more transformational, that are more impactful, that people feel that, okay, I want to use my connection for X, Y, and Z. It could be a women's organization or women that want to build a feminist movement in their communities. It could be about having access to a new type of health information that is necessary in a community. And so there's different ways that those are tackled, but they need resources, they need funding, they need support, and none of these is possible if governments and other stakeholders work together to make it happen. And so you probably are aware about something called universal service funds that many countries have used, some more successfully than others, to fund this kind of initiative. In other instances, and I want to use the example of West Africa, many countries don't actually have the policy and regulatory frameworks that allow and support community centered connectivity solutions. And so in West Africa, the ECOWAS, which is the Economic Commission, we worked with them to develop a new framework for universal access that changed the restrictions and removed the restrictions on community access to make it possible. And not only that, but to make it so that these funds can support community networks, which before then was forbidden. It was not allowed. Everything had to be an exception. And so this goes to the point that community-centered connectivity solutions have proven to be impactful, good in many ways for communities, sustainable also. So there's no such thing as this constant criticism of that they're not sustainable, therefore they shouldn't be worth it. But they need that support, and we need to be supporting them. So that's really critical for this to happen. And many regions are now working on it. Some countries, I'm sure Senka and Henriette can share some of that, have really gone into establishing proper frameworks to support these kinds of developments. We need to see more. A lot more, and it needs to be widespread. And governments have to embrace that as a natural business option in any kind of market. There's no such thing as a digital society if you don't have the multitude, right, of possibilities. And this is one of the most critical options, especially given the fact that we have massive digital divides, massive gender digital divides, massive urban-rural divides, and so on and so forth.
Thanks, Sonia. Actually, your ECOWAS example also just reminded me of a recent legislative win that we had right here in the Asia Pacific, in the Philippines, in fact. The government, after a 10 or 12-year-long advocacy battle, actually recognized, universal access as a statutory imperative, right? So that means that the entire community, all the stakeholders working in the Philippines or involved in the country, now actually have to recognize universal access as, a right that's protected by law. And that's the kind of digital transformation efforts that I feel like I want to maybe go to Henriette on. Henriette, you've obviously had a long career advocating for a lot of these things that we're talking about today, and you've seen a lot of wins as APC as well, right? There are maybe a couple of things that absolutely should not be issues when we're talking about community-centered connectivity, but still continue to be so. And I want to maybe bring you in very quickly to comment on resourcing and sustainability of community initiatives, the ones that we're discussing from your experience.
Thanks, Niti. Also, I want to just point out, we have in the room Gustav Iskander from Common Room in Indonesia. Is Somot from the Philippines still here, or has he stepped out to something else? Another session. Just because, these, and then, of course, there are the people in India and the deaf community. So please, maybe Gustav can talk some of their examples as well. I think that what is really important is to look at community-centered connectivity in two ways. On the one hand, there are providers of connectivity, and connectivity is important. It's empowering in its own right. And I think it's very important that as we advocate for meaningful connectivity, we don't develop a double standard, which I'm afraid the world has been operated on, that if you're rich and if you're in California, you can use your internet access to play online games all night long and no one gives a damn, or you can watch TV programs and that's fine. And you'll probably gain a lot of skills and become an entrepreneur in the process because you spend so much time playing with the technology that you're so empowered that you can start creating new solutions and apps. On the other hand, if you are in a poor rural community somewhere in Central Africa, you better make sure you are using your connectivity for public health or for small-scale agriculture and accessing markets, all these solutions that the donors like to show on their reports. I think that it's important that I think, and Sonia she talked about connectivity on your own terms and where that's meaningful for you. I think we mustn't lose sight of that. In fact, this is not a good example. My son, who is as privileged as they come, has just moved to Barcelona to do a PhD, and he claimed to me last night that he doesn't have meaningful connectivity because he can't watch cricket, because he wants to watch the India-South Africa series, and he's trying on a VPN to access the South African channel that he would access at home, and he can't. So he's claiming he doesn't have meaningful connectivity. It's nonsense, but anyway, I think that the connectivity part of it is important, and it's a right, it's an entitlement. We should all have it, as they've decided in the Philippines. On the other hand, I think we need to look at these initiatives as part of diversification of economic power and control and initiative and entrepreneurship. And I think what I find when we particularly looking at financing and sustainability, and APC has done a lot of work. By the way, my work with APC at the moment has been largely on working with the local access program, which Gustav and Def are part of. There's financing in most developing countries for small business development. There's a recognition that emerging market economies depend largely on the informal sector and on small and medium enterprise. And it's not enough, but there are sources of lending, of loan funding, of investment for these small, medium, and micro enterprises. But does this exist for community connectivity? Not at all. Is community connectivity recognized as being a driver for local economic development? Not really. Maybe at a big picture level, there's an analysis of the fact that more digitalization, more access can drive economic development, even though a lot of the analysis of what is economic development is also a bit skewed. So I think that's the second way we need to look at community connectivity, that it's part of a local community empowerment ecosystem. And that can involve use of technology, human capacity, addressing very local problems, local needs. And I think the power of connectivity is that it underpins all of that. If you're a village with artisans, having connectivity is going to create opportunities for those artisans. If you a village with a local school, and they want to play cricket and watch cricket. They want to have access. So I think that's very important. I think, and there's not enough of that. I think the narrative about how digitalization and the digital economy operates is very much captured by the big players, by the powerful companies, the platforms, the big telcos, mobile data, the growth in the mobile sector, smartphones, devices. And I think in that narrative, the opportunity for economic and social empowerment and the interconnection between economic and social empowerment and the role that a community connectivity initiative can play in that is completely overlooked, I think. It's not taken seriously. It's underestimated. But maybe people in the audience can also share more. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but I tried.
So that maybe brings me to one of the last pieces of the puzzle. Of course, the puzzle is a huge one. We can't possibly touch upon everything, but broadly. Senkai, maybe just want to very quickly bring you in. We are running a little bit short on time, but talking maybe about how we truly make community-centered connectivity solutions interventions systemic. By talking about regulatory impact, by talking about digital transformation efforts, where governments, policymakers are involved with stakeholders like ourselves to make this a whole of government, whole of society approach to building ecosystems and supporting communities.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think so. There are some interesting examples. One of them would be the case of Brazil, where the Anatel, the regulator, has decided to form a working group on community networks, like within the regulator, and that working group is comprised of members of Anatel itself, Ministry of Communications, some other like community networks members. maybe some ISPs, but yeah, it's like a multi-stakeholder working group working on promoting community connectivity and creation of public policies. Also exploring initiatives like sharing public fiber, so infrastructure sharing policies, or linking community networks to school connectivity projects in remote areas, and so on. Another not very similar example is from South Africa, where actually with the help from APC and FCDO, Community Networks Association has been formed, because you have to remember that community networks are like very, very small organizations with very limited resources and human resources, whereas like large telcos have entire legal teams and research teams that then enable them to do some regulatory work and participate in the consultations and so on. And the small community networks don't necessarily have that capacity, and they're also quite invisible on a national scale. So by creating this association, the community networks in South Africa have come together to operate under an umbrella institution and jointly participate in all these processes, either with ICASA, the regulator, or that also gives them potentially access to funding, whether universal service funds or some other incentives that other ISPs or SMEs are eligible for.
In fact, they've just submitted a document. There's a new spectrum management policy being developed in South Africa, and the association submitted their position on what they'd like to see in that spectrum policy.
So yeah, there's definitely more power when coming together. So these two examples from Brazil. So the Brazil one can be seen as a little bit more like top down, because it's the working group sits within the regulator, whereas the South African one is more bottom up. There is no right or wrong, I guess. In every it's very contextual. It depends on the jurisdiction, on the country, on the current political climate in the country. So yeah, I guess now this is a very recent development in South Africa, so time will tell. But yeah, good things are happening.
Thank you so much to Sonia, Henriette, and Senka. I'm afraid we have run out of time and we're already behind schedule, so I do not want to impede on your next few sessions that we are holding in the same room. And I'm so sorry that we didn't have more time to interact with you and learn all about your experiences with the issues that we're discussing. But we still have the next almost day and a half together, so I'm sure that we'll have lots of opportunities to talk with each other and really continue this meaningful dialogue of mutual learning, because I think it takes a community to advocate for a community. So thank you so much, Sonia, Henriette, and Senka.
Thank you.
And look forward to the next few sessions that we have here.
So we just ask people in the room who are actually running local ISPs or community networks to put up their hands so we can go and talk to them. Just identify yourselves if you're a practitioner in this space. Okay, good.
Nice. Well, go talk to them and learn. And also feel free to come talk to us. That's great.
All right. Thank you.